This is Dr. Matute, UAPTC, Human Anatomy and Physiology. And this is our second discussion or lecture on the circulatory system. Today we'll briefly discuss the human heart. The heart is located under the rib cage. It is a little bit left to the sternum. The sternum is the breastbone. The heart is found between the lungs, and the heart is shaped like a pear that is put upside down, like a pear put upside down. And the heart has the size of your fist, and you can call it to be a powerhouse. So one more time, it is located under the rib cage. It is located a little bit to the left of the sternum. It is located between the lungs. It is shaped like an upside down pear, and its size is the size of your fist, and you may consider to be a powerhouse because it brings about movement in the human body. Functions. There are three main functions of the heart. Number one, it pumps blood throughout the body via the circulatory system. Number two, it supplies oxygen and other needed nutrients to the tissues. Number three, it removes carbon dioxide and other waste from tissues. It removes carbon dioxide and other waste from tissues. Now let's quickly look at, say something about the external anatomy of the heart. So if you have a heart model in front of you, or an actual heart in front of you, or a heart diagram in front of you, what are you going to see? What are some of the anatomical features that you are going to see? Number one, we should be able to locate the ventricles, left and right ventricles. Number two, the atria, left and right atria. Number three, we should be able to see the coronary artery. Next, we should be able to see the cardiac vein, sometimes called the coronary vein. See the cardiac vein. And we should also be able to see the apex. The apex is slightly tilted to the left. Great vessels of the heart. Why are some vessels called the great vessels? Number one, they are the largest vessels of the body. Number two, they are directly connected to the heart. Number three, they supply blood directly to the heart, or they take blood away directly from the heart. So one more time, why are some vessels called great vessels? They are the largest vessels of the human body. They are directly connected to the heart. They take blood directly to the heart, or they take blood directly away from the heart. What are examples of blood vessels that are categorized as great vessels? Number one, we have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Number two, we have the aorta and the descending aorta. Aorta and descending aorta. Number three, we have the pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. Pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. Now let's go over to the internal anatomy of the heart. Again, if you have a diagram or a model in front of you, or a real specimen of the heart in front of you, what are some of the anatomical features that we are going to see? Let's start with the layers of the heart wall. There are three layers to the heart wall, from the outside to the inside. Number one, the epicardium. So the epicardium is the outermost layer. The epicardium is made up of loose connective tissue, elastic fibers, and adipose tissue. loose connective tissue, elastic fibers, and adipose tissue. Functions of the epicardium: it prevents excessive movement and excessive expansion of the heart. It is protective. Two main functions: protection, and it prevents excessive expansion and excessive movement of the heart. Layer number 2, which is the middle layer, the myocardium. The myocardium is made up of cardiac muscle cells. The technical name for cardiac muscle cells is cardiomyocytes. Cardiomyocytes. When this middle layer contracts, because it's a muscle, when it contracts, it pumps blood throughout the body. When this middle layer contracts, it pumps blood throughout the body. Layer number 3, endocardium. This is the innermost layer. It is made up of endothelial connective tissue. Endothelial connective tissues. It lines the inner surfaces of the heart chambers and the heart valves. Lines the inner surfaces of the heart chambers and the heart valves. Now let's look at the heart chambers. The heart chambers. There are 4 heart chambers. So if you look at the diagram of the heart and the internal anatomy, you see 4 chambers. We have 2 superior chambers and 2 inferior chambers. The superior chambers are called atria for plural. One is called atrium, plural atria. Then we have the inferior chambers are called ventricles. So we have the right atrium and left atrium, right ventricle and left ventricle. The right atrium receives oxygen-poor blood from the body into the heart. It receives oxygen-poor blood from the body into the heart, and then it pumps that oxygen-poor blood to the right ventricle. So you receive oxygen-poor blood from the body, and then it pumps it or it channels it to the right ventricle. The left atrium, on the other hand, receives oxygen-rich blood into the heart. Receives oxygen-rich blood into the heart, and then it pumps that blood or it channels that blood to the left ventricle. The ventricles. There are 2 ventricles, right ventricle and left ventricle. The right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary arteries or pulmonary trunk. In other words, the right ventricle pumps oxygen-poor blood out of the heart to the lungs. It pours oxygen-poor blood out of the heart to the lungs. The left ventricle, on the other hand, pumps oxygen-rich blood to the general circulation via the aorta. It pumps oxygen-rich blood to the general circulation via the aorta. Now, if you have a diagram, if you are looking at the diagram of the chambers of the heart, you will see that the walls of the atrial walls are thinner than the ventricular walls. The atrial walls are thinner than the ventricular walls. Why are the atrial walls thinner? The atrial walls, they contract to push blood from the atrium to the ventricles. That's a short distance. So they pump blood from one chamber of the heart to another chamber of the heart. That does not require lots of force. The ventricles, on the other hand, they pump blood out of the heart. They pump blood out of the heart. Because they pump blood out of the heart, they need more force. So they need thicker muscles to provide them with that force. That's why the ventricular walls are thicker. Now, if you look at the two ventricular walls, the left ventricular wall and the right ventricular wall, the left ventricular wall is thicker than the left, sorry, yes, the left ventricular wall is thicker than the right ventricular wall. Why is that? The right ventricular wall, which is relatively thinner, it pumps blood to the lungs. The lungs are in close proximity with the heart, so it is not a long distance, so they require less force. On the other hand, the left ventricular walls, they pump blood to the general circulation, the blood that goes to all parts of our body. So it requires greater force, so the walls are thicker. The septum. The septum divides the heart into left half and right half. Left half and right half. On the left side of the heart, where you have the left ventricles and the left atrium, left atrium and left ventricle, they contain oxygen-rich blood. The right side of the heart, which contains the right atrium and the right ventricle, they contain oxygen-poor blood. The blood from the right side of the heart, which is oxygen-poor, is pumped to the lungs so that the carbon dioxide can be exchanged for oxygen. Remember, oxygen-poor blood means that it has a lot of carbon dioxide in it. And oxygen-rich blood means that it has a lot of oxygen in it. So the blood that you have on the right side of the heart is oxygen poor, which means it is rich in carbon dioxide. It is sent to the lungs. On the other hand, the blood that you have on the left side of the heart, it is rich in oxygen, so it is pumped to the rest of the body tissues. We do not want oxygen-rich blood and oxygen-poor blood to mix. There should be no mixing between oxygen-poor blood and oxygen-rich blood. The septum ensures that oxygen-rich blood and oxygen-poor blood do not mix. So it prevents mixing of oxygen-rich blood and oxygen-poor blood. Heart valves. Heart valves. Valves have two main functions. Number one, they control blood flow from one chamber to another. Number two, they prevent blood backflow. So control of blood and prevention of blood backflow. That is the function of valves in the human heart. There are two main groups of valves. We have the AV valves. AV valves. The AV stands for atrioventricular. Atrioventricular valves. These valves, they allow for blood to leave the atrium and then go to the ventricle. That's why they are called atrioventricular. They allow for blood flow from the atrium to the ventricle. So from the right atrium to the right ventricle, from the left atrium to the right ventricle. So we have these atrioventricular valves between these chambers. It controls blood flow from the atrium to the ventricle, and then it closes to prevent backflow into the atrium. So once that it has allowed blood to flow from the atrium to the ventricle, it will close to prevent that blood from going back to the atrium. The second group of valves are called semilunar valves. The SLV valves, semilunar valves. The semilunar valves, when they open, blood is pumped out of the heart, and then when they close, they prevent that blood from coming back into the heart. These valves are associated with the ventricles. Remember, it is the blood in the ventricles that is pumped out of the heart. So two, we have two semi-lunar valves. One that is found on the left side of the heart, that will be called the aortic semi-lunar valve. The aortic semi-lunar valve. This valve is located at the base of the aorta, at the base of the aorta. When it opens, and then the left ventricle, when it opens, then the left ventricle will pump blood out of the heart, and then once that blood enters the aorta, that valve will close to make sure that that blood does not return to the left ventricle. Then that blood will be transported out to the rest of the body. If we come to the right side of the heart, the right side of the heart, we have the pulmonary semi-lunar valve. Every time you hear pulmonary, it actually means lungs. Any blood going to the lungs is oxygen poor blood. So the pulmonary the pulmonary semi-lunar valve, it pumps blood from the right ventricle to the lungs. This valve is located at the base of the pulmonary artery. So when the right ventricle pumps blood, the pulmonary semi-lunar valve will open, that blood will pass through those valves, and then once the blood has passed through those valves and into the pulmonary arteries, then the valve will close to make sure that that oxygen poor blood does not come back to the heart. So one more time, there are two types of valves. The AV valves, they control movement of blood within the heart from atrium to ventricles. And then the semi-lunar valve, they control movement of blood from the ventricles to outside of the heart. The next thing we want to look at is let's look at the coronary circulation. So based on what we've said so far, there are two circulatory systems. The right side of the heart is associated with the pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary circulation means the circulation of oxygen poor blood. The left side of the heart is associated with what we call the systemic circulation. Systemic circulation is circulation that contains or that propels oxygen-rich blood. So we'll have systemic circulation, and then we'll have the pulmonary circulation. These two circulatory types, though they pass through the heart and they are controlled by the heart, but the heart itself does not use that blood. It is blood that is used by the rest of the body except for the heart. So the heart has its own circulatory route. It is called the coronary circulation. Coronary circulation. And earlier on, when we were looking at the external anatomy of the heart, we mentioned coronary artery and cardiac vein. The coronary artery and cardiac vein, these are the major vessels, these are the biggest vessels in the heart that controls the coronary circulation. So the heart has its own circulatory system, which is called the coronary circulation. Now, whenever you hear of a heart bypass surgery, it means that the coronary arteries of the heart, they are probably blocked somewhere. They are not capable of supplying the heart with all of the oxygen-rich blood that it needs. So what will happen is, if this condition persists, what will happen is that some tubes will be attached to the aorta that carries oxygen-rich blood from the heart to the entire circulation. Some tubes will be connected from the aorta back to the coronary arteries of the heart. So in other words, they'll put some tubes that will tap blood, or that will channel blood from the aorta back to the heart. So it is this tube, when they put a tube there that can take oxygen-rich blood from the aorta back to the heart, those tubes, when that type of a surgery is done, that will be called bypass surgery. And depending on how serious the situation is, we could have one of those tubes, we could have up to 4 of those tubes. And if you have 2 of those tubes, then they'll call it a double bypass. If you have 3 of those tubes, they'll call it a triple bypass. If you have 4 of those tubes, they'll call it a quadruple bypass. That will be a very, very serious situation. Now, what will happen if the heart is starved of oxygen-rich blood? What will happen if the heart is starved of oxygen-rich blood? Then the heart cells will begin to die. The heart cells will begin to die. That is what is called myocardial infarction. Myocardial infarction. That results to cell death. And of course, if that actually continues, then the heart will stop functioning. Now let's look at some anatomical properties of cardiac muscles. Over 90% of the heart is cardiac muscles. It makes sense because when we say the heart is pumping blood, it is the contraction of the heart that constitutes the pumping of blood. So it makes sense that the heart is mostly muscle tissue. But how do we describe cardiac muscles? They are striated. Now, you are going back to your AMP1 now. They are striated, they are short, they are fat, they are branched, they are intercalated, and they function via a sliding filament mechanism. They are also self-excitable. So one more time, characteristics of cardiac muscles: striated, short, fat, branched, intercalated. They contract by a sliding filament mechanism, and they are self-excitable. They are self-excitable. Okay, all of this, that's a review of your EMP1 material. Now let's look at the energy requirement of the heart. The heart normally uses energy that comes from carbohydrates. So the heart uses oxygen, and then it makes its energy from carbohydrates. That's the primary source of energy for the heart. Uses oxygen to make energy from carbohydrates. However, in the absence of carbohydrates, it could still use protein and lipids to make energy. The primary source is carbohydrates, but the secondary sources will be lipids and proteins. The cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle is quite simple. It's contraction and relaxation. Contraction and relaxation. Contraction is called systole. Relaxation is called diastole. So when the heart contracts, which is systole, it will relax, which is diastole, then it contracts again. Heart sounds. When the heart is contracting or when the heart is beating, if you have some enhanced equipment, you can actually clearly tell the sounds. So you have two types of sounds that are normal. We have the lub, L-U-B. That is when the AV valves are closing. You have the lub sound when the AV valves are closing. Remember, when the AV valves, when they close, they prevent backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atrium. Then you have the dub sound, dub, D-U-P, D-U-P, the dub sound. That is when the SLV valves are closing. That's the semilunar valves, when they are closing. Remember, when the semilunar valves, when they close, they prevent blood from coming back into the heart. Now, those are the normal sounds that you get that is made by the heart. Then you may also have what we call the heart murmurs, M-U-R-M-U-R-S, heart murmurs. These are abnormal sounds that the heart may make. Where does this abnormal sound come from? It is when a valve does not close properly, there's going to be backflow of blood. There's going to be turbulent backflow of blood when a valve does not close properly. So it could be an AV valve or it could be a SLV valve. If it does not close properly, then it means that we're going to have some backflow of blood. It is that backflow of blood that makes this abnormal sound. It's as if your heart is murmuring. So if your heart does not, if the valve does not close, if the valve do not close tightly, then we're actually going to have these heart murmurs, which are abnormal. Good. Now let's quickly look at heartbeat. How is our heartbeat? How is it controlled? Control of the heartbeat. Number one, pacemaker cells. Pacemaker cells are found in the right atrium. Right atrium. They are responsible for the normal heartbeats. Responsible for normal heartbeats, they are the pacemaker cells. They are located in the right atrium. Then the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, too, can control heart rate. The ANS has two centers that control heartbeat or heart rate. Number one, you have the sympathetic center. It increases heart rate. For example, if you are out there working out. Then number two, you have the parasympathetic center. It slows down heart rate. Slows down heart rate. Then number three, we have chemicals, epinephrine, tyrosine, and calcium. They increase heart rates. Chemicals like epinephrine, tyrosine, and calcium, they increase heart rates. Now let's quickly look at some homeostatic imbalances of cardiac output. Number one, we have the congestive heart failure. So we're looking at homeostatic imbalances of cardiac output. We have, number one, we have congestive heart failure. This is where the heart is not pumping enough blood in the body. So for example, in women it's 4 to 5 liters. In men it is 5 to 6 liters. If the heart is not able to pump that amount of blood throughout the body, then that will be referred to as congestive heart failure. Then next, we have the pulmonary congestion, where one half of the heart fails. Remember, we have the right half and the left half. One half of the heart fails, so the blood just sits in there. That will be called pulmonary edema. That will be called pulmonary edema. Now, to conclude this, let's quickly say something about the aging aspects of the heart. We have sclerosis and thickening of heart valves. So the older you get, sclerosis sets in. Sclerosis is abnormal hardening of tissue. Abnormal hardening of tissue. That's what is called sclerosis. And if that happens, your valve will not be closing properly. Then they will also have, number two will be decline in cardiac reserve. Cardiac reserve is the amount of blood that is normally left in the heart even when blood is pumped out. You need to have that cardiac reserve for your circulatory system to be functioning 100%. So if there's a reduction of that cardiac reserve, then your circulatory system will not be functioning properly. The last one is fibrosis. of the cardiac muscles. So you're going to have a lot of fibers are actually going to be incorporated into the cardiac muscles. And when that happens, you start having irregular heartbeats that are too fast, heartbeats that are too slow. So irregular heartbeats that are too fast, heartbeats that are too slow. These three conditions are collectively referred to as arrhythmias. Arrhythmias.